What's good, everybody? Welcome to the Big Nate Review. It's your boy Big Nate, and today, as usual, we have a fire-ass video to talk about. Today we are talking about the philosophy of war and peace. And so the inspiration for this video really came because alongside this book, I've also been reading The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer. So just, some light reading going on here. But War and Peace, as much as anything, is a work of philosophy of history. And so as I was reading this, I was seeing a lot of the principles being written about by Tolstoy in War and Peace just play out to an absolute T in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. And on top of that, there have been a lot of things taking place in modern American politics, which again, I think are just the principles of War and Peace just played out right before our eyes. So we're going to be talking about Napoleon, the War of 1812, Hitler, World War II, and like I just said, a little bit of a Trump and modern American politics sprinkled in. So that's going to be the topic of this video. If that sounds interesting to you, pop squat. I got my cup of tea brewed, so I'm going to be sipping on that. And then without further ado, let's get right into the video. And I think the best place to start is just with a very bare bones, what is the core philosophy of Leo Tolstoy's ideas about history that he puts forth in War and Peace. And I think the main two ideas, obviously there's no substitute for reading this whole text itself, but I do think the main ideas can be summed up with two major concepts: the idea of chance and the idea of genius. And Tolstoy is going to do a whole deep philosophical dive into these concepts, but he starts by introducing them in terms of how the modern historians tend to think about these ideas. And I think this is true just at an everyday intuitive level too, is that chance creates the circumstance and genius profits from it. So just an example of that is with the idea of chance. The idea that always comes to mind for me is the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, his assassination, which ultimately kicked off World War I, which of course set the stage for World War II and the modern geopolitical space. The way that I was taught about this in school was that there was this guy who went to go assassinate the Archduke, but he wasn't able to access him. Like, the procession was too far away. There was no way he was actually going to get up to the Archduke to be able to do his thing. So bro he kind of just bails and he goes to a sandwich shop. And so he's just sitting there eating his sandwich, and then what do you know, lo and behold, the procession happens to pass right by the sandwich shop. This gives the assassin the perfect opportunity. He goes, assassinates the Archduke, and the rest is history, so to speak. And that is just one example of thousands, if not millions, of those chance circumstances, which if that one little thing had been different, if he didn't stop at the sandwich shop, if the procession happened to not pass by there, the entire face of the world right now could look totally different. So that's this idea that Tolstoy is going to do some deconstructing on, this idea, what is chance? And on the other side, you have the idea of genius. There are certain personalities in history, for instance, of course, Adolf Hitler being a prime example, who just seem to have a disproportionate effect on the way that history plays out. Like, you could imagine if Hitler was someone different, if he never rose to power, the world will look completely different today. So too does Tolstoy write about Napoleon as one of these genius figures, just personalities who have like he says, a disproportionate effect on the overall course of history. So again, these are the two ideas, and Tolstoy formulates how people think about it by saying chance creates the situation, genius profits from it. But then what Tolstoy does is he just poses the very simple questions: what actually is chance and what is genius? And his way of thinking about it is, okay, some such and such a phenomenon occurs, we don't know why that happened the way that it did, and because we don't know, we simply call it chance. And so too with genius. He says, we see power which produces effects incommensurate with common human qualities. We don't know why that happens, and so we call it genius. But this idea of chance and genius, these are just words that we are ascribing to things that we ultimately don't know the source or nature of. These are just terms we have attributed to things that we ultimately cannot explain. And so what Tolstoy's big mission in War and Peace, I would argue, is to actually deconstruct and really look into what these ideas actually mean. And he starts off by talking about Napoleon, of course, and the War of 1812, and this idea of chance, an unlikely series of events. Like, that term I think is really important, an unlikely series of events, because someone like Napoleon, well, first off, to even set the stage, the entire set of events, which was the French Revolution, had to take place. And then there's this whole conspiracy of power, which despite his blunder after blunder after blunder, Tolstoy writes that somehow Napoleon is able to seize his way to the top. And Tolstoy even describes Napoleon as being like a scoundrel, which is very much like Hitler too. Hitler was someone who was literally starving in the alleys, doing petty crimes of Austria. But against all odds, Napoleon in this case rises to power, and then he goes on the endless war campaigns in Africa and in Italy, and he talks about how Tolstoy says several times Napoleon is on the brink of destruction and at the very last moment is saved in some unexpected way. So there's just battle after battle where he's basically getting bailed out. And the whole trajectory of Napoleon's career is just basically, as Tolstoy says, an endless series of so-called chances. And that mimics very strongly, I think, the rise of Adolf Hitler and the rise and fall of the Third Reich. William Shirer himself is one of the historians that Tolstoy might actually be calling out in a way, because he is constantly mentioning at every single point the unlikely series of events that have to take place for Hitler to rise to power. And I mean, it's even cliche at this point, but it is still nevertheless true that if Hitler had not been rejected to art school, if he got accepted, especially in his like financially difficult situation, bro's just like, you know, a vagabond doing one thing or the other, if he got accepted into art school, there's a really good chance he would have just pursued that. And that is just one of countless things that seem to just stack in Hitler's favor, especially as we get into the political stuff where he's doing things which he basically commits like armed high treason and somehow only gets like a year in jail, and people keep turning the other cheek despite him. He wrote all of Mein Kampf, for instance, very early, and it's like this tyrannical tirade of just like, I hate Jews and I'm gonna conquer Europe, and nobody seems to care. They just let him do his own thing, even if he continually grows and grows in power. And the way that Shirer is describing it, I think, is very analogous to the way that Tolstoy describes the rise to power of Napoleon. And then even the actual course of World War II, like I've just got done reading like the Czechoslovakia section here, and that one is just crazy. Czechoslovakia was protected formally by Russia and by France and by extension then Britain. So they were protected by 3 different countries. And then Hitler, kind of for no reason, even his generals and people are like, why are you doing this? But Hitler is insistent on taking over Czechoslovakia. And it's such a bad idea that his generals even like conspire against him. No one's lifted a finger against Hitler in opposition at this point, really. But even his generals are like, dude, if he does this, he's gonna start a world war. And they even go so far as to reach out behind Hitler's back to France and to Britain. They're like, you guys are going, like, first off, Hitler's gonna invade Czechoslovakia. Understand that. Second, you guys are gonna protect Czechoslovakia if he does so, right? And they're like, yes, of course, of course. And this happens multiple occasions to the point where it's like, okay, if they're gonna back Czechoslovakia up, the generals are going to have this uprising against Hitler. He should be toast. Hitler should be done. And yet, against all odds, Russia, they bail out. France, they bail out. Britain, that everybody just bails. Hitler is able to invade and conquer Czechoslovakia against all common sense. William Shirer even says that the actions of these countries was beyond understanding. And I love that phrase because it does seem like there are certain arcs in history which, as Tolstoy says, these unlikely sequences of events which just seem contrary. They seem like impossible that they should have ever arisen. And I feel like what Trump is doing right now is a great example of that, where like for one, out of nowhere just starts a whole worldwide tariff war with like the biggest, I'm not even going to get into that, but a judge just got arrested. A court appointed state sanctioned judge just got arrested. ICE agents. ICE, by the way, is the absolute equivalent of the SS. They are now able to raid people's houses without warrants. The US citizen who was recently mistakenly deported to El Salvador. The Supreme Court, the law of the fucking land, the backbone of the Constitution, has unanimously decided bro needs to come home, and yet nobody's doing a thing. Here he is. It's been like 2-3 weeks now. No one's lifted a finger, and already Trump is like soft launching his 2028 dictatorship, like already selling merch, and there's stuff around, there's propaganda around the White House. And it's just like, these are all the signs that it's just like, how is this able to happen, right? It's beyond understanding how this is able to continue as long as it has been. And all of these are examples, I think, of Tolstoy's principle of chance in history. And so let's get now a little more into how Tolstoy ultimately answers this question. And to me, I don't think he uses this phrase in the book, but the way it reads to me is almost like a historical determinism. And it's very analogous, I think, to our individual notions of free will and chance and determinism and stuff like that, because for each of our own lives, there's a whole bunch of events which, if that one little thing had been different, if I had like waited, if I went at that green light, I might have got T-boned. If I never went out that one night, I would have never met so-and-so. If I never applied to that job, right? We all have instances in our life, circumstances which, if they had played out differently, the whole trajectory of our lives would look completely different today. And yet, if you really break down this idea of chance within an individual, there really is, this is the classic argument of, like, this goes back for time immemorial, the idea of determinism. Like, every act you did was completely contingent on the thousands, millions of preceding causes before that, which was based on the preceding causes before that, and it just goes all the way back until ultimately Tolstoy would say the origins of human civilization. And this is what Tolstoy is talking about. Like, if you have a circumstance, right, something happened, Hitler gets rejected from art school, Napoleon rises to power, all these different examples, that had to happen. It was of necessity that had to happen, because all the thousands of preceding causes and factors that led up to it made that decision inevitable. And when you talk about Tolstoy specifically, like the War of 1812, that was the result of millions of individual wills interacting and synergizing, and the sum total of those wills is precisely how the course of history had to play out. So I think my interpretation of this text is that Tolstoy actually does not believe in the idea of chance, especially in terms of like historical circumstances, is that it's almost like this tidal wave of history. And that's very much how it feels like right now, for instance, in modern America. Like, it just feels like you're being swept along this current, and we don't know where it's gonna go yet, right? It could, there's tons of possibilities from here, and that's why the actions of individual wills. This is Plato. Society is not made of sticks and stones, but of individual characters who, by turning the scales one way or another, determine the direction of the whole. And in this sense, it is almost sort of empowering, because if it is the sum collection of wills, and that begins with us, and our individual actions do matter, and yada yada yada. But overall, just talking about this idea of chance, I think Tolstoy eschews the notion that there is any such thing as chance, and that everything that's playing out is precisely as it had to inevitably be since, again, perhaps the beginning of civilization. And this idea is very related to the other half of this argument, which is the notion of genius, that there are certain personalities, there are certain figures in history who have a disproportionate effect on the way that things play out. And I actually want to lead into this with a part mentioned in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, where he's basically like, yes, Hitler absolutely changed the face of the world. If it weren't for Hitler, the whole thing would have played out differently. But William Shirer says, in some way, it's not Hitler who created Germany, but Germany who created Hitler. Because after World War I, Germany was totally butthurt. They kind of got shit on with the Treaty of Versailles. They're in debt, everyone's jobless, and there's a sense of national pride being injured. And so in a way, Hitler was inevitable. And I do feel like there's an analogous thing almost with America and Trump, where like our culture, our state of society, it just seems like has become so degraded and corrupt that we have made someone like Trump inevitable. Because Trump to me is like the symbol in many ways of everything that's wrong with America. The hyper-capitalism, the stupidity, the narcissism. And to bring Jung in here, it's almost like the collective psychology of America like produced Trump and made him rise to power. And this is very related to what Tolstoy writes about in War and Peace with Napoleon, who he says, we imagine Napoleon as guiding this whole movement, but that's as mistaken as thinking that the figure that's carved on the prow of a ship is the thing that's actually leading the ship itself. The figurehead that is at the front of the movement, we would mistakenly think as guiding that, when really, of course, it's the winds and the sails of history. And Tolstoy says Napoleon is nothing more than a child who, grabbing the straps that are tied inside the carriage, fancies that he is driving the whole thing. And he even has a huge theme of this book is that it's actually the people who are most in power who are actually least in control of their will. And Tolstoy describes Napoleon's rise to power and his political career and everything like that. He says it happens almost independently of his will, because at every step Napoleon is blundering, but it's as if history itself, the circumstances of history, it's almost as if they were conspiring to make Napoleon's rise to power inevitable. And another conclusion of all this that Tolstoy talks about is that we will realize it is impossible to view these people as anything otherwise than normal people. And Tolstoy makes a very strong point of this in the book, where he makes these great figures like Napoleon and Alexander. You get to see them behind the scenes, and low-key they are very like mediocre people. Napoleon's actually low-key kind of a loser. And in things like these great battles, for instance, Napoleon's giving orders here, giving orders there, but in the chaos of the battle, it totally falls apart. Nothing happens as planned. That's another huge theme of this book. Like coming up with drafting these elaborate plans beforehand, they instantly just turn to dust the second the war and the fighting actually gets started. So Napoleon's just shooting off these orders, none of them are being followed, and then it's basically the outcome of the battle. Like if the French win, then Napoleon's seen as a genius. It was his military instruction and genius that happened. And if they fail, they also get the blame. So this idea that Napoleon is a genius is something, it's laughable, and it's something that Tolstoy is constantly critiquing throughout the book. But in a nutshell, that is the philosophy of War and Peace. If you have read this book, if you have any other ideas you want to talk about, if you've read The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, I'd love to hear it, or just any thoughts you have on this topic at all. In the meantime, get to my Instagram at Big Nate's Book Reviews, and thank you for watching the Big Nate Review.